So today we're going to talk about interfaces, right? Basically, what are interfaces and how do you use them? Okay, so let's get started. So an interface is another way that you can create a kind of a data type, uh, and using this interface you can then do other things, right? So let's just actually dive into it and it'll become clearer. Okay, so first things first, I go to my package and I right click and I say Java class. So this is a bit of a misnomer. You'll see how we can create an interface. So you just click on that, and let's say we want an object or a data type which has the ability to print itself every time, right? So I'm going to say I'm going to create an interface called Printable. So select interface and enter, right? So the IDE has created a file called printable.java, and this is an interface. Now, what is the difference between an interface and a class? An interface really is a way to create a data type which has only functionality that you have to implement. Okay, so actually let's dive into it and you'll see how. So let's say this function, this interface has a function called print. Now, if you notice, when I define this interface, I don't actually have to have a body for this print function, right? I can actually just create it as what is known as an abstract method or an abstract function. So what is the meaning of abstract? Abstract means there is no body in for this function, right? Now, how do we use this printable? Okay, so let's say, for example, I had a function in main, a static function. So you now know how to create functions and static functions. So this should be fine. And this function says, just say test. Okay, and this function takes a printable called P, right? Now, this object printable or this data type printable really comes from this interface, and this interface has this abstract function called print. So as of right now it actually does nothing, right? So how do we make this interface useful and sort of make it sort of useful for us and actually do things, right? Even without using, or rather creating what is known as implementations of this printable, right? We can actually write our code as though we had already done it. So I could say p.print and this code will actually all compile, right? There's no problems here. But if you run this code, you won't actually get any sort of results from it because, yeah, I mean, there's no body behind this print function, right? So to add some substance to this interface, what we'll do is we'll actually have to create a class. So let's say I create a class called box. Okay. Now this class could implement printable. Okay. Now if you notice, there is a red line in the IDE, and if you mouse over it, it says class box must either be declared abstract or implement an abstract method print in printable, right? So you could just click on implement methods and it will give you a list of all the methods that printable actually defines. In this case, we know that it defines only one method called print and it returns void. So I'm going to say that. And if you notice, the IDE has actually done a lot of work for us, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say system.out.println, sorry, box.print called. Okay, so now this printable function can be actually put to some use, right? So what we could do is, let's say we create a box B called new box. This should be familiar to you now if you've been following the other videos, right? Now I could pass this variable B, because it's of type box, to this function test, right? And why is that? This test function takes a data type or a class, or actually data type is a better term, of printable, right? Box is obviously, I mean, box is not a printable in the sense that box is a box and a printable is a printable, right? But what makes a box a printable as well? Okay, this comes from the definition of box itself. You can see clearly that we said your box implements printable, right? And if you had box implementing other interfaces, all you have to do is just put a comma and just add the others. So one of them that's built into Java is called auto closable, for example. And then again, it's underlined because I have to implement the methods of auto closable, right? But we won't do that here, but I just wanted to show you how you could add more interfaces to your class, right? So the reason this code now will work, so for example, I'll say test B, right? The reason this code works is because when the Java compiler comes to this line, it will look at test and it will look at the argument you passed, test. The argument is a box, okay? So it will then go to the class box and see whether box implements printable. In this case, it actually implements printable, so it will treat this box variable as a printable, right? And on this P, you can only call functions which are in printable. So if box had another function, let's say void test in this case, which let's say just does nothing, right? We actually can't call, let's try to do that, p dot test. If you notice, it doesn't even autocomplete. So from the point of view of this function that is test, right, because it takes a printable, the variable p can only point to or reference methods which are in the printable interface, right? So now actually you can create as many interfaces as you want, just so that you can limit the number of, so when you create a class, you normally have data in the class and you have a lot of methods, right? But sometimes that's not really required, because all you want is this test function. All it wants is it wants to take an object which implements. So the way you would read this actual code is test takes an interface or takes an object that implements printable, okay, and does its work. So it could be box, and in this case it could be like, we could create another class. So let's say square, right? And we could say implements printable, right? And then we could say, again, I can just go up, mouse over it and say implement, because I'm lazy, and this is what you would get. And I would just do the same thing here. So I'll say system.out.println square.print God, right? So here I could actually say square s equals new square. That's just creating an object in memory. And then I could say this, and this code too will compile, right? So in fact, if we run this code, you'll see box.print and square.print, right? Now, one other thing that you would need to know about printable is you could actually define a method, right? So let's say void, so this is it. So default void, let's say test2, okay? And when you create a default method, you can actually now give it a body, right? So why does Java have this feature? So when you create an interface yourself and you add methods to it later on, right, all the classes that implemented this printable interface would need to implement the new methods you added to this printable. Now that would mean a lot of code will actually break, right? So what Java does is the pragmatic thing, which is gives you this option to create this thing called a default method. A sort of a default abstract, default method, which it's not really abstract now because you've provided a body for it. But this is really just a kind of indication for the people using your code that you really need to do work here. Please create your own test2 function, right? But I could actually call it here. So I could say test2 and this code would work. So first it uses the boxes print, then box is saying, because you've called it from box here, this method gets printed out. But in this case, please create your own test2 function. The substance of this test2 function came from this body, right, which is in the printable class. But it's just a kind of a placeholder telling you that you really should be creating your own test2 function yourself. So for example, I could say right click and let's say generate, right? And you can then say implement methods and you can say test2, right? So this is another really good reason why you should be using an IDE for your stuff, right? So I could say system.out.println, and in this case I'm going to say box.test2 called, right? And just let's run this. And now you'll see for test2 and print, I'm using the versions which are in the box class. But for square, I'm using one function which is in the square class and one function which is in the interface, right? So interfaces are a really good way of giving classes extra functionality that you can implement. The alternative could have been the extends keyword, which we studied about in the previous video, in a video about classes and inheritance, for example. But the problem with extends is you can only extend from one class. So a square can extend from a shape, for example. It can't extend from multiple classes and get more functionality that it could implement, right? But implements, which uses interfaces, gives you that sort of flexibility. So this basically covers how you would use interfaces at a very basic level. If things aren't clear, then please comment and I could probably help you out. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in and see you in the next video.